in 1965. Yesterday was recorded. And
When people talk about the Beatles, there's always debate over their greatest achievement. Some point to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, others swear by Revolver, and many insist the White Album represents their peak. But for George Martin, the man who guided them from a scrappy Liverpool group to the most important band in history, there was one song that stood above the rest. A song he felt could never have been written by human hands alone. He described it as divine. He believed something larger than the band, larger than himself, was involved in its creation. That song was Yesterday. By 1965, the Beatles were evolving at breakneck speed. They had already transformed from chart-topping pop idols into innovators, pushing rock music into uncharted territory. Yet in the middle of this transformation, Paul McCartney dreamed a melody. It came to him in his sleep, fully formed, haunting and unforgettable. When he first played it for others, the response was immediate. This wasn't just another Beatles song. This was something else entirely. George Martin instantly recognized its brilliance. He believed Paul had tapped into something extraordinary, something beyond human effort. It wasn't the typical collaborative process of Lennon and McCartney bouncing lines off each other. It wasn't a group jam session that turned into a hit. It arrived, fully intact, as if it had been handed down. Martin once admitted he thought Paul had been chosen, at least in that moment, to deliver a melody that felt eternal. But the birth of Yesterday was not without tension. At first, Paul doubted the song. He was convinced it had to be something he had accidentally stolen. For weeks he played it for people, asking if they had heard it before. Nobody recognized it. Slowly, he began to accept that it was his, yet even then he worried whether it belonged in the Beatles' catalog. It was too soft, too different, too personal. John Lennon wasn't particularly impressed. He dismissed the track, not out of jealousy at first, but because it didn't sound like the Beatles. George Harrison didn't have much to say either, and Ringo Starr was silent. For them, it felt detached from the group identity. But George Martin saw it differently. He knew the song had to be recorded. The challenge came in the studio. Unlike every Beatles track before it, Yesterday didn't require the full band. Paul's acoustic guitar and voice carried the entire piece. George Martin proposed something radical, adding a string quartet. It was an idea that could have been laughed off. A rock band working with classical musicians? For 1965, this was nearly unthinkable. Yet, Paul trusted Martin's judgment. The result was a recording unlike anything the Beatles had released before. When Yesterday was finally completed, Martin sat back and realized what they had created. It wasn't just another track for help. It was a timeless work that blurred the lines between pop and classical, between rock and art song. He believed no matter how many songs the Beatles wrote, Yesterday would remain unique. For Martin, it was the moment he felt divine inspiration had entered the studio. But Yesterday also exposed the fractures within the group. John Lennon resented the way the song became Paul's showpiece. He didn't sing on it, he didn't play on it. Neither did George or Ringo. For a band that prided itself on collaboration, Yesterday marked a shift. It showed Paul could stand alone, and it hinted at a future where his songs would dominate. George Harrison, often marginalized in the Lennon-McCartney partnership, must have noticed this too. For years, his contributions were overshadowed, and here was Paul recording what many called a masterpiece without needing anyone else. The imbalance within the band grew sharper. Ringo later admitted that Yesterday was one of the few Beatles tracks he had nothing to do with. It reinforced his role as an outsider when Paul's more personal songs took the spotlight. Tensions that would eventually explode during the White Album and Let It Be sessions were quietly seeded in this moment. Still, George Martin defended Yesterday fiercely. He believed it justified every risk they took in the studio. It opened the door to experimentation with orchestras, sitars, tape loops, and more. Without Yesterday, the Beatles might never have dared to create something like A Day in the Life or Eleanor Rigby. It gave them permission to break free from the guitar, bass, drums formula. But Martin's reverence for the song went even deeper. He thought it was perfect in structure, haunting in melody, and unmatched in emotional pull. He said it felt like the kind of song that only came around once in a generation. To him, Paul had received a gift, and his role as producer was to protect it. Critics agreed. Yesterday became one of the most covered songs in history, recorded by artists across every genre. It appeared in films, commercials, and concerts for decades. Its influence reached far beyond rock. Classical musicians embraced it. Jazz players reinterpreted it. Even crooners who had dismissed the Beatles as a teenage fad now performed it on stage. Yet within the band, the song remained divisive. John Lennon, years later, would admit he didn't feel connected to it. For him, the Beatles were about energy, rebellion, and electricity. Yesterday was too delicate, too soft, too much Paul. George Harrison never spoke about it in glowing terms either. For him, it represented the imbalance he resented for years. Only Paul and George Martin seemed to recognize its true weight. Paul himself, despite his pride, sometimes downplayed it. He didn't want to be remembered only for Yesterday. He wanted recognition for pushing rock forward, for innovating with psychedelic sounds and daring lyrics. But no matter what he wrote later, people always came back to that one haunting melody from a dream. George Martin never wavered in his belief. He often said that if he had to choose a single Beatles track to define their genius, it would be Yesterday. Not because it was the most complex or the most daring, but because it felt eternal. It sounded like it had always existed, as if Paul had simply uncovered it, rather than written it. And that was why Martin called it divine. He believed the song was too perfect to be explained by chance. For him, producing it wasn't just another day at Abbey Road. It was a moment of transcendence. A moment when music reached beyond entertainment and touched something higher. But like many things in the Beatles' story, even divine inspiration came with conflict. Yesterday was both a triumph and a warning. It showed the heights Paul could reach, but also the isolation that came with them. It revealed George Martin's vision for the band, but also exposed the limits of collaboration. It was the sound of genius, but also the sound of a band beginning to pull apart. Looking back, it's easy to see why Martin cherished it so deeply. In a career filled with groundbreaking recordings, Yesterday stood out as the one moment he felt he was working with something beyond human design. It wasn't just the Beatles making history. It was, in Martin's eyes, something closer to destiny.